Liquidity ratio calculation. The formula for getting the current ratio divided by current liabilities. In 2019, we get 1.87, and in 2020, we get 1.13. The formula for quick ratio, current assets minus inventories divided by current liabilities. In 2019, we get 0.45, and in 2020, we get 0.28. Net working capital, the formula is current assets minus current liabilities. In 2019, we get RM474.07. In 2020, we get RM94. As we can see here, the current ratio in 2019 is more than in 2020, which is 1.87 in 2019 and 1.13 in 2020. And the quick ratio also, as we can see, in 2019 it is 0.45 and decreased to 0.28 in 2020. For net working capital, we can see that in 2019 we can get RM474.07, and in 2020 it is only 94 ringgit. Profitability ratio calculation. Return on equity, earning after tax divided by common equity. In 2019, 0.08, and in 2020, 0.06. Then return on assets, earning after tax divided by total assets. In 2019, we get 0.06 and 0.04 in 2020. Gross profit margin, gross profit divided by sales. In 2019, we get 1.01, and in 2020, we get 0.76. Operating margin, operating income divided by sales. In 2019, we get 0.97, and in 2020, we get 0.79. Lastly, net profit margin, net profit divided by sales. In 2019, we get 0.91, and in 2020, we get 0.69. Liquidity ratio calculation for Berjaya Corporation Berhad. The current ratio, current assets divided by current liabilities. In 2019, we get 2.02 and 1.16 in 2020. Quick ratio, the formula is current assets minus inventories divided by current liabilities. In 2019, we get 3.53, and in 2020, 1.52. Net working capital, current assets minus current liabilities. In 2019, we get 711,974, and in 2020, 241,839.
Assalamualaikum, my name is Najmi Teacher. My metric number H21A2481. From this ratio and activity ratio for IOI group, the asset turnover ratio increased from 6.09 to 6.22 in 2019 to 2020. The account receivable turnover has increased in 2019 to 2020 from 0.26 to 0.20. For inventory turnover for 2019 to 2020 show in 2019 is 7.46 and decreased to 5.89. From 2019 to 2020, the fixed asset turnover show increases from 1.93 to 2.22. From this graph show an activity ratio for Berjaya Group Corporation, The asset turnover ratio increased from 3.2 to 5.23 in 2019 to 2020, while the account receivable turnover has increased in 2019 to 2020 from 0.20 to 0.30. For inventory turnover for 2019 to 2020 in 2019 is 3.83 and decreased to 0.2 from 2019 to 2020. The fixed asset turnover increased with 0.35 to 4.15. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum and hi, my name is Alisha binti Ibrahim. My number match is H2182078. So I would like to present about leverage. First of all is about IOI group. Based on the graph, it shows that the leverage or debit ratio calculation for the IO group. The total debit ratio for 2019 shows data of 0.27%. Meanwhile, for 2020, the data is 0.28%. Next, for the debit equity, the data for year 2019 is 0.37%, while in 2020, the data shows increasing to 0.40%. Last but not least, the data of time interest earned in 2019 is 9.31%, and it is increased in 2020, which is 9.40%. We can compare to the company, the second company, which is Berjaya Corporations Group. We can see on the data on the graph. Based on the graph, it shows a leverage debt ratio calculation for the Berjaya Corporations per head. The total debt ratio for 2019 shows data of 0.18%. Meanwhile, for 2020, the data is increasingly to 0.19%. Next is for the debit equity. The data for year 2019 is 0.22%, while in 2020 the data shows increase 0.23%. And lastly, the data for the time interest earned in 2019 is 0.09%, and it increased to in 2020 to 1.70%. So that's for the data for leverage in IOI Group and Berjaya Corporation Group in 2019 and 2020. Okay, next I will present about the probability ratio of Berjaya Corporation Berhad. Based on the graph that we can see, the shows is probability ratio that calculation for Berjaya Corporation Berhad. The return of equity for year 2019 is 0.02%, same with the year in 2020 that we see there is no increase or decrease. It's similar. Next, the data of return on assets in 2019 is 0.01%, while in 2020 is 0.02%. For the next thing is for the gross profit margin data in 2019 is 0.13%. Meanwhile, in 2020, we can see that is 3.06% data. For the data, operating margin for 2019 is 1.33%, while for 2020 is increased a lot, which is 3.06%. And lastly, the data for the profit margin in 2019 is 1.46%, and for 2020 is 1.08%. This is because I think it's because of COVID-19, so it's increased a lot after the MCO. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nur Patricia Sahira binti Muhammad Zaidi. My number metric is H2182961. The graph shows data about the current ratio for both companies, which is IOI Corporation Berhad and Berjaya Corporation Berhad in 2019 and 2020. The data shows that the current ratio for IOI Group in 2019 is 1.87, while Berjaya Corporation is 2.02. Meanwhile, in 2020, the data shows that Berjaya Corporation has a higher current ratio of 1.16 than IOI Group, which is 0.30. The graph shows the quick ratio for both companies, which is IOI Group and Berjaya Corporation, 2019 and 2020. The data shows that Berjaya Corporation has a higher quick ratio, 3.53, than IOI Group, 1.87 in 2019. Meanwhile, in 2020, Berjaya Corporation still has a higher quick ratio, 1.52, than IOI Group, 1.13. This is because the IOI Group does not have inventory, and the fastest way to manage current liabilities through current asset, while Berjaya Corporation has inventory that helps to manage its current liabilities. Based on this data, we can conclude that the Berjaya Corporation has a higher quick ratio to manage its finance for short-term obligation than IOI Group, because Berjaya Corporation has inventory that could help with the liabilities. Based on the data and graph data above, it indicates that Berjaya Corporation has higher net working capital, which is 711,974 in 290 and 738,475 in 2020, while IOI Group 474.7 in 2090 and 794 in 2020. The database of both companies has shown that Berjaya Corporation has higher because Berjaya Corporation has more total current asset than current liabilities, which make it manageable for short-term obligation, while IOI Group does not have enough current asset and less than total current liabilities, which make it hard for them to manage short-term obligation. For total asset turnover, in 2019, Berjaya Corporation has a higher total asset turnover of 5.060 than IOI Group by 3.73, but in 2020, IOI Group has a higher turnover of asset by 0.5, while Berjaya Corporation decreased to 0.4. Based on the data, we can conclude that IOI Group has a more efficient way and effective to manage its asset to generate sales. Based on the data above, it indicates that Berjaya Corporation has a higher account receivable turnover value for the year 2019 and decreased in 2020 by 7,686,201 and 0.50, while IOI Group only had 435.30 for 2019 and 50.53 for 2020. It indicates that Berjaya Corporation still maintains and has a higher average collection than IOI Group for both the years 2019 and 2020, which is 1,680. Meanwhile, IOI Group only had 0.83 for 2019 and increased to 23 for 2020.
Hi, Assalamualaikum. My name is Rafati Fariha binti Zakaria. My metric number is H1A2327. For inventory turnover, Berjaya Corporation has a higher value of inventory turnover for both year 2019 and 2020, while IOI Group has lower inventory turnover in both years. It shows that Berjaya Corporation has used inventory properly to generate profit and sale. For fixed asset turnover, Berjaya Corporation has a higher value of fixed asset turnover of 5.60 in 2019 and decreased to 0.04 in 2020. Meanwhile, IOI Group for fixed asset turnover was recorded at 3.73 in 2019 and 0.05 in 2020. We can conclude that Berjaya Corporation is better at managing its fixed asset to keep the company generating a sale. 2019, the IOI Group has debt ratio of 0.268% higher than Berjaya Corporation, which is 0.179% in 2019. In 2020, the IOI Group will still have a higher debt ratio of 0.285% higher than Berjaya Corporation, which is 0.187%. IOI Group company has a higher equity value for both year 2019 and 2020. Meanwhile, Berjaya Corporation has 0.218% and 0.230% for the year 2019 and 2020, which is less than IOI Group. For this section, IOI Group has 5.623% of time interest earned for 2019, while Berjaya Corporation has 5.06% value. In 2020, IOI Group faced an increased value of 4.69%, while Berjaya Corporation faced decreased value, which is 2.69%.
Hi, my name is Rosmaliza binti Muhammad Rusli. My metric number is H2182628. I'm going to present my part, which is comparison return on equity IOI Group and Berjaya Berhad in 2019 and 2020. From the graph above, for 2019, the Berjaya Corporation has a higher value of return on equity by 0.10%, while IOI Group has 0.08%. In 2020, we can see that IOI has a higher value of return on equity of 0.06% than Berjaya Corporation's 0.1%. From the comparison, we could see that IOI Group have a higher value of return equity and has a proper way to deal with its negative value because it get better in 2020. Comparison return on asset IOI Group and Berjaya Corporation in 2019 and 2020. Based on the data above, IOI Group return asset is 0.07%, higher than Berjaya Corporation, which is 0.02%. In 2020, IOI Group company decreased to 0.04% for return on asset, while Berjaya Corporation decreased to 0.01%. From the analyzed comparison, we could see that IOI Group company is better at managing return on investment than Berjaya Corporation. Comparison gross profit margin IOI Group and Berjaya Corporation in 2019 and 2020. Based on the data above, in 2019, IOI Group has a higher gross profit margin of 100.5% than Berjaya Corporation by 0.13%. In 2020, IOI Group decreased its gross profit from 100.5% to 76.4%, but Berjaya Corporation still be the lowest gross profit margin, even though the company shows an increase from 0.13% to 3.06%. Based on the comparison, it could indicate that IOI Group are the highest contribution for its margin. Comparison operating margin IOI Group and Berjaya Corporation in 2019 and 2020. Based on the data above, in 2019, IOI Group has a higher operating profit margin of 16.4% than Berjaya Corporation of 0.35%. Meanwhile, in 2020, IOI has a higher operating profit margin of 18.7% than Berjaya Corporation by 0.19%. Based on the comparison, it could be indicated that IOI Group made a huge contribution to its margin. Comparison net profit margin IOI Group and Berjaya Corporation in 2019 and 2020. Based on the data above, in 2019, IOI Group company has a higher value of net profit margin of 90.9%, while Berjaya Corporation has 0.01%. But in 2020, the net profit margin for IOI dropped to 69.3% and Berjaya Corporation increased from 0.01% to 1.89%. Based on the comparison, we could argue that Berjaya Corporation cannot manage to gain profit for the next year.